Welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international events. We try to compile this review for you, the aspirants for the UPSC examinations, so you get an adequate insight into what are the important issues in international relations, how they impinge on India's foreign policy, how they affect our national interest, and at the same time also get an understanding into the changing power questions the world over. And there has never been a still moment for the past couple of months, a little more than a past couple of months really, ever since Russia undertook a special operation, a euphemism for its invasion of Ukraine, and the whole world, the balance of power or the existing relationship has been turned topsy-turvy. There has been an economic crisis, there has been a refugee crisis, and as the war in Ukraine enters the fifth, it has entered the fifth month, and there is no hope of a respite in near future. We have a very good opportunity to take a stock of what has happened in the war. There are hardly any gains for any parties, but both parties claim that there have been gains. And what are the losses? They have been massive for both parties, not only for both parties, but for the rest of the world. So what we'll do this time is to have a look at the war in Ukraine, from which we have moved at times away to other crisis points in recent past. We also would like to use this ground to have a look at the international economic system, how it has affected India's international trade, India's prospects for economic growth in the near future, India trying to get back its economy onto the rails after the COVID. And in this context, we'll take a look at India's trade relations with China, which have grown despite the COVID phenomenally, and so has the trade imbalance, and India's trade relations with USA, which remain the most important, and also India's relationship with Russia, which has changed economic relationship, which has changed substantially, significantly since the outbreak of the Ukraine war. We also will have a look at EU, which is India's third largest partner after USA and China, and how all this has been affected by the conflict in Ukraine is the backdrop. At the same time, there are other events which are taking place. EU again is a multinational organization which is driven by splits within itself. Macron, the French president, who thought that he would be the uncrowned king of Europe in foreign policy, at least in autonomy of strategic policy making, has suffered a dramatic defeat in the election for the parliament, and he is more or less being viewed as a lame duck. Not only he is a lame duck, what is happening in Germany is also causing concern, because the Greens are a part of the coalition and they are very unhappy about the Germans going back to coal. They had opted out of the nuclear energy, and they are under great pressure if the Russian gas doesn't come to them in time. We have these situations, and we also have a look at the United Kingdom, where Boris Johnson has survived a no-confidence move, but he keeps on blundering about Brexit, and the problems left behind, the legacy, the bitter legacy of Brexit, continues to haunt us. This again is going to cumulatively impact on India's prospect of a swift economic recovery and India's trade relations. So all this is one broad picture. The war in Ukraine perhaps is the most dramatic and significant event in the 21st century, the third decade of 21st century, which is probably going to influence the international relations as much as the 9/11 attack on the trade towers or the regime changes which America undertook in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya. And all this has resulted in a transformation of international relations as the post-2000 generation grew up into. It is natural that whenever there is a war, the newspaper headlines and the TV headlines are shrieking, are full of loss of life, deaths, gory deaths, blood and gore. And so it is that the major part of the attention, the international attention of the general reader, has been focused on loss of life. Now, the loss of life, there are figures which are contested by both sides. They are part of the cyber activities. They are exaggerated at both times to get sympathy or to demonize the opponent. But more or less, there is a general agreement that Ukrainians have lost some 13 to 15,000 soldiers in the war. Many more have been wounded. The Russian side has lost perhaps a little more than this number, because they were the ones who were invading. They were the ones who had to meet with resistance of various kinds of urban guerrillas, of targeted killings and so on. But then they have not had a loss of civilian lives except in the Donbass, where civilians sympathetic to Russians or partisans resisting the Russians have been fighting. They are not regular soldiers in uniform, and they should be counted as civilian deaths. So the civilian deaths probably again run into thousands. A very tragic event. There are certain times when school children have been killed, where women have been killed, where patients in the hospitals have been killed. Some of them have taken shelter in plants, in hospitals, in schools, in malls. The Russians claim that the Ukrainians have deliberately used them as human shields to attack the advancing Russian forces. So it is difficult to judge these figures, but by and large, it is a tragic loss of human life, both of soldiers and of civilians. The other number which has drawn our attention is a very large number of Ukrainians who have been rendered refugees. Almost a little over 1/4 of the population of Ukraine has been rendered refugees. Although the Ukrainian government under Zelensky had said that no able-bodied adult should exit out of Ukraine, should fight to save the country, and it was very happily accepted by various Ukrainian youth. But even the number of women and children and older people who have moved out, who have been allowed to move through humanitarian corridors and go abroad, number about 8 million. It is a very significant number if you keep in mind that the total number of refugees at the moment estimated by UN agencies is about 100 million, so which comes very close to 8% of the total figure, 8 to 9% of the refugees. And this has caused some concerns in international community, because the international community, especially the European nations, have shown transparently double standards in receiving these white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed refugees. Quite in contrast the way they have treated refugees coming from Africa, from Turkey and other Asian countries. So there is this affinity of race, color, shared religion, which has exposed the hypocrisy of the European nations welcoming these refugees. Now, also the burden of refugees has been put to a very large extent on the frontline states like Poland and Hungary, who have also had differences in past with Russia, its authoritarian control of their economies and societies, suppression of their democratic aspirations. These are not paragons of democratic virtues. They themselves are totalitarian, authoritarian regimes, but their resistance to the domination by Soviet and then Russian Communist parties has also made them not allies, but adversaries on the other side. Ever since they joined the European Union, there has been some kind of a difference between the East European members who were admitted to the European Union and the other members of the European Union. Like countries like Hungary and Poland very gladly accept the economic assistance which they can get from Europe, but when it comes to subscribing to the same values in terms of human rights, in terms of LGBTQ rights, in terms of democracy, in terms of freedom of expression, there have been major differences. Now, what happens interestingly when this large influx of refugees from Ukraine ends up in Hungary, Poland, and then again keeping in mind the European Union, no borders, can migrate into other countries, it causes a very great threat that even if a minuscule number of these refugees is agent provocateur, that can destabilize various countries' relationship with Russia. That's one. Then again, if people who are considered their own kith and kin have to be looked after first, how much money, how much resources would be left with European Union members of other European Union countries to provide succor for the refugees elsewhere? So this humanitarian crisis of Ukrainian refugees seems to put askew the entire refugee crisis which the world was coping, and we are talking about humanitarian crisis. Now, let's talk in terms of loss of property. Now, there are widely fluctuating estimates. In the month of April, it was said that the United Nations was estimating that about $60 billion worth of property has been lost or destroyed in Ukraine. This seems to be a gross underestimate, because the Ukrainian government, of course, claims that the loss of property amounts to more than 565 billion US dollars. It seems more close to realistic assessment, because the whole cities have been flattened, the whole infrastructure has been destroyed, not only by the invading Russian armies, but in the scorched earth strategy which the Ukrainians have followed themselves, trying to resist the Russians, destroying their own rail tracks, bridges, highways, etc. And if you add to this the loss of the hospitals, schools, housing establishment, it seems more likely that the figure put forward by the Ukrainian government is nearer the truth. And this is no way, the losses continue mounting. It is not only the loss of life, the loss of property, or the refugee problem which is causing concern. There are other issues. Several red lines have been crossed. The types of weapons that have been used in Ukrainian war again remind us that all wars allow the military-industrial complex, the traders in debt, the arms merchants to showcase their latest weaponry, which can find markets elsewhere. So a nation is destroyed, people are devastated, but for the manufacturers of armaments, this is a great advertising opportunity, like the Gulf War in past war was, like Iran-Iraq war in past wars, or like even this regime change, high precision warfare used in Afghanistan was then, although it did not gain America its military objectives, but the demonstration of high precision strikes, thermal target seeking, etc. were advertised to the world, and gullible third world countries bought these armaments. What has happened in Ukraine is that from the beginning there has been a use of drones of a very primitive domestic entertainment variety, to scout targets, to hover over it, to create confusion, to jam electronics, and also highly sophisticated drones which could not only spot a target, but hover over it and then target a single tank or destroy it totally. There has been a wide array of anti-aircraft missile systems used. There have also been news items that Russia has used a hypersonic missile, a very high precision strike weapon in Ukraine. There also have been fears and apprehensions that Russians might use chemical weapons to terrify the Ukrainians, make them surrender. The Russians on their side have said that this is part of cyber. The Ukrainians themselves might use biological chemical weapons against advancing Russian troops, and they are preparing the ground to charge that the Russians did this. The Russians have also crossed certain red lines. Those who analyze nuclear warfare and nuclear proliferation have said, when Putin says that when Russia's existence is threatened, Russia will not hesitate to use nuclear weapons. First, the discussion was about tactical nuclear weapons, but there is no such thing, as experts point out, as tactical nuclear weapons. A nuclear weapon is a weapon of mass destruction, and you cannot confine the radioactivity or the destruction or the thermal shocks to a small area. So if you are targeting something in Ukrainian border, which it shares with Eastern Europe, the risks of the conflict exacerbating into an all-encompassing mad destruction of a nuclear holocaust is very, very much rare. Similarly, when Ukraine is given long-distance missiles which can strike beyond the Russian border, it can cross the Donbass region, which the Ukrainians continue as part of their territory. It might hit targets in Russia, and Russians may think that it is crossing another red line. But what the experts say, that even talking about the potential use of nuclear weapons creates some kind of instability in a nuclear deterrence, where since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was considered absolutely unimaginable to use nuclear weapons. So this balance of terror seems to have been eroded in Ukraine. So you keep that. Keep that in mind. Another interesting dimension of the Ukrainian war after 4 months, which we can see is the psychological warfare. Now, the psychological warfare in this case, the Ukrainians apparently in the first phase were winning hands down. Zelensky was grandstanding. It was expected that he would run away, he would surrender, he would sue for peace. He did nothing of that kind. His omnipresent. He makes a virtual appearance in the US Senate. He goes into the House of Congress. He addresses the UN General Assembly. He addresses the special meetings of the Security Council. He goes to the European Union. He goes means virtually. And everybody else comes to Kiev to meet Zelensky in his capital, his besieged capital, which is a moral support of a certain kind that the top world leaders from Macron to Boris Johnson to Secretary of State of United States of America, nobody is hesitant about visiting Kyiv and is expressing their support, wholehearted support to Zelensky. But slowly the Russians have regained some ground because Russians may not have sympathy of the Western media or the Western media watching audience on their side, but they have made the point that despite being surrounded, besieged, and being confronted with insane economic sanctions, they have not only survived, they have continued with their push. They had to retreat probably for a short while, but they have slowly, steadily pushed and recaptured a lot of ground. They have probably controlled all of Donbass region now, which gives them an uninterrupted territorial belt, tract of land from Donbass through to the Crimean Peninsula. This gives them a dominating position in the Black Sea, and they can say that, look, they have created a buffer between them and the hot front which the NATO was trying to push towards Russia and make them defensive. So there is this psychological warfare which Russia seemed to lose out in Western media, but right now it seems to have conveyed to the rest of the world, signaling to large countries like India, like to Indonesia, that if they are valuing their own energy security, their food security, Russians still are a far more reliable partners, if not allies, than the West. The West ultimately is going to look after the strategic interests of the United States and its West European allies. So if Russia once again, it was earlier argued that Putin had given up the Eurasian heritage of Russia, but was looking only towards Europe, pushing only towards Europe, has indulged in this psychological warfare successfully to the extent that there is an Asian part of Russia which is attracting not only China, not only Indonesia, not only India, but other countries which were supposed to be allied to the West at one stage. Iran is squarely at the moment in this Russian-Chinese camp, the bloc, if we will call it a bloc. Central Asian republics are here. And there is this thing which Putin has also succeeded in conveying, that the West has not been able to break its will even after expelling it from the SWIFT system. Much is being made out that Russia has, for the first time in last century, defaulted on its sovereign debt, servicing of its debt. But Russians can claim that, look, we have the money, we are willing to pay. It is only the Americans who are trying to play the dog in the manger, not allowing us to use the SWIFT system and make the payments. We can make it in gold, we can make it in kind, we can make it in oil, we can make it in rubles. So the Americans, again, the American hegemony over the dollar-based international foreign exchange system is being exposed, and over a period of time, the Russians stand to gain in also this psychological warfare. So this is one part. So it is easy to demonize Putin as a dictator, easy to demonize Putin as a Nazi following in the footsteps of Hitler, but at the same time, the American holier-than-thou attitude, whether it comes to race relations, whether it comes to democracy versus authoritarianism, to respect to international law, the double standards have been exposed again and again in Ukraine. So we come to this. Now it comes to the final aspect of the consequences of the war in Ukraine, the economic consequences. Ukraine was a very important producer of wheat. 30 to 40% of the wheat imported by various African and Asian countries, including some countries in Europe, it was the breadbasket of Europe. The war has interfered with the transportation of the grain stored in the silos from Ukraine to the rest of the world. Partly because the Black Sea has been blockaded, partly because Ukraine itself has mined the sea to stop Russians from entering, bombarding things like Mariupol and so on. The Russians at the moment have dominating influence there, but the ingress and excess out of Black Sea again is risked. So how do you transport these food grains? How does a war-torn Ukraine harvest another crop and feed its own people. So this is one issue of food security which impacts almost everybody. At one stage, Indians thought that they could substitute the Ukrainian wheat exports with Indian wheat exports, but this led to some internal dissensions and political debate, and this export was stopped. Indians, of course, claimed that they would still not renege. They will live up to their promise to save people from their food security who need it very urgently. But almost 40% of the population, not only in the poorest countries, but in the middle income countries like Egypt, like Indonesia, are threatened with malnutrition and food shortages in very near future. Iran itself is having some problems. So this is one aspect of the food security. The other aspect is the energy security, because the moment the Russians were imposed with sanctions and they could not offload their gas and oil into the European market, although Europe bought some peace by saying that they will cut short all imports by December, by the end of the year, but this has impacted on the oil prices. The Saudis and the UAE have not always cooperated by increasing their oil production and reducing the oil prices. The Americans continue to monopolize their oil politics, their oil refining and export politics. So there have been various responses engineered. We shall discuss these when we discuss India's trade relationship with Russia in greater detail. But even India has been constrained to increase its oil imports from Russia at a discounted price. China is a major buyer. And of course, countries as far away as Peru and Venezuela are depending on oil passing through several hands to them in a distance things. So this is the impact of the economic consequence of war in Ukraine, to which India cannot remain indifferent. India will have to walk a tightrope for quite some time to come, because India, if it draws closer to Russia, is likely that although it's highly unlikely, but there is a possibility, a small possibility of the West trying to impose some sanctions on India, but it might be suicidal for West, because then they would be losing out a potentially a very important partner, not only to cope with Russia, but to countervail China. So this is the state of the play about Ukraine at the moment. Truth be told, the international economy had never really recovered from the meltdown of 2008. It had started getting back on rails when the Russians invaded Crimea and for all practical purposes annexed it. The Americans were forced to impose sanctions on Russia, and some kind of a trade war was started during President Trump's regime against China. So now these Chinese had ingratiated themselves so well into the Western economies through their supply chains, through their supply of intermediaries, through their telecom equipment, through their cheaper electronic goods and so on. And of course, they had taken over the assembly lines of various American companies in China's special economic zones. So it was impossible to disentangle the Western world from China. The lip service was made and everybody wanted some time to get out of its entanglements with Huawei and so on. But before this could happen, the COVID struck. And the COVID demonstrated the dependence of the rest of the world on the supply chain originating in China, and also the threat of a pandemic which globalization had caused. So this has only been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. But what has happened is it has played havoc with major economies in the world. The Americans are going through a very bad recession, unprecedented in decades. The federal rates have been raised, which is going to have very interesting implications for the rest of the world. It is said that when America sneezes, the world catches cold. It changes the metaphor from earlier colonial times, but the point is that the USA is so dominant in technology, in international systems of foreign exchange transfers, and it sort of controls so much of the oil, so much of the food, so much of the technology, that it is reluctant to let go of this monopoly. And unfortunately, the stagflation in America is likely to impact on the rest of us. We tend to forget, most of us, most of the time, that USA is the most important, most substantial trade partner for India. We often talk of China, we'll come to China in a minute, but America is almost 11.8% of India's international trade share. China is marginally behind, but is behind nonetheless. So we have to worry about how the American economy or its ill health or the stagflation or the federal rates increase is going to affect us. Now it is going to affect us because 40 to 55% of the earnings of the Indian IT companies depend on the business from United States. Also, the most sophisticated technology which is required to advance fast is at the hands of Americans. Not that it is a guarantee that it will come to us automatically unless there is a quid pro quo, but there it is. The interesting part is this. The American investment in India is massive. The Indian earnings through services are massive. Now, if the federal rates increase, so the capital which had driven out of United States to more lucrative markets with higher interest rates like India would follow the interest rate back to safer markets where ease of business is better, where they are operating in a familiar milieu, so they will go out. And this will impact adversely on India's international trade, not only on India's trade with the United States, but all over the place. Another distressing signal is that Indian rupee has fallen vis-a-vis the dollar rather drastically and very fast, despite all efforts of the Central Reserve Bank in India. We have crossed the psychological barrier of 78 rupees to a dollar some time back, and there is no sign that this is going to reflect in increased exports for India or profitable exports for India. It is going to impact adversely. Also, if the foreign capital moves out of India, the US capital moves out, it will adversely impact on job creations, employment market, and so on. Now, the Indian economy at the moment is faced with problems of employment generation, inflation, expectations and aspirations of the farmers, the division between what the industry wants, what the agricultural sector wants, what the unorganized sector has, and these are likely to have impact on the political instability. As we approach the general elections of 2024, the next year is going to be crucial. If the federal rate is increased more in the United States, the flight of capital, US capital from India to USA continues in an accelerated fashion, no amount of business to business or government to government interactions is going to restore the situation to normalcy in a great hurry. So India has to be prepared for this. We come to China. And the Chinese situation is even more ironical. India and China, ever since the military conflict in Galwan 2 years back, June, this is almost 2 years are complete, has been adversarial, tense. But despite this, and despite COVID, in the past year, the Indian trade with China has increased phenomenally, almost 39-40%. And with it has grown the trade imbalance. The trade imbalance is glaring. India is exporting hardly $6 to $7 billion worth of, the Chinese give slightly different figures, but nobody can hide that it is less than 10% of the US dollar value of what we are importing from China. What is even more deeply distressing is that what India exports to China is really raw material, is iron ore, it is chemicals, it is minerals. It is not value-added products to which China adds value and re-exports. And what China exports to India is cheap electronics, etc., value-added projects. So there has been, the Chinese strategy has been to separate the two. They argue repeatedly that border problem is a legacy of history. It will take a long time settling down. So we should separate that, as Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had put brilliantly, and he was criticized for that, put that in the back burner. And let's talk about increasing trade. But the risk in this strategy is that if India falls into this trap, India's elbow can be twisted by the Chinese on the economic battleground as well. If India is dependent, as the COVID exposed again, that the pharmaceuticals intermediaries were imported from China, most of India's exports depended on spares for automobiles and other things from intermediaries received from China. So if the Chinese supply chain to India is blocked, then India's exports to other countries is going to be severely affected. There is no way Indians, for the first time in 30 years, as a token gesture, the Chinese have imported some rice from India. India is one of the largest rice producers in the world. China is one of the largest rice importers in the world. But Chinese had scrupulously avoided putting their food security vis-a-vis China on India. India cannot export pork to China. There are other sources of beef export to China, pork export to China, Australia. Pork excluded, there are exports available to China from the ASEAN countries also. So there is a very limited scope of Indian manufactured goods capturing the Chinese market, however huge the market may be. The Chinese themselves have enough production capacity to look after their own market and look after their expansion of infrastructural companies. And in India also, we have had entry of Chinese companies in infrastructure sector, in various other sectors of joint production. But ever since Galwan, there has been a dampener on this. There have been restrictions on Chinese companies bidding in certain areas like infrastructure or sensitive areas. But it is again going to be very difficult for India to disengage from China, because so huge is the dimension of scale of this. And various people say that is a good thing, that if the economic relationship prospers, then maybe the military strategic relationship can be normalized. But I think the risks of this being adversely used against India is great. For India, China remains a principal adversary, not only in the strategic battlefield, but in the economic battlefield also. So the Chinese would definitely not like how India has excluded itself from the mechanisms which they have set up to counter American influence or interference in South China Sea. But Indians cannot let the Chinese influence expand in South China Sea and impact adversely or India's national interest, maritime trade in Southeast Asia. India doesn't have to be worried about spreading itself thin in the Indo-Pacific region. But the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, and Chinese machinations in India's neighborhood from Bangladesh to Sri Lanka to Maldives have been warning signals enough. So there is no reason to believe that the expanding trade with China, also coinciding with expanding trade imbalance, is likely to create a climate more favorable for resolution of the border problem. Then we come again to trade and politics. No government in India can afford to compromise on the border after the perfidy and the betrayal in Galwan and the muscle bulging in other sectors in the disputed border, and China's repeated support to Pakistan, who's been harboring terrorists adversely who have mounted attacks to India. And this is likely to be a problem for India's trade policy. Now, how does India diversify its exports, diversify its services, diversify its imports for intermediaries other than China, so our dependence on China decreases? Unfortunately, the war in Ukraine has put India in a very difficult spot where it finds itself willy-nilly on the same camp where Russia, China, Iran are there, and Pakistan, of course, is ironclad relationship with China. And also India's proximate neighborhood in ASEAN region is under the shadow of China, so India cannot neglect that. The problem is likely to remain for India because India would, for a long number of years, remain a distant fifth or sixth economy in the world, where China might overtake in foreseeable future the number one economy in the world, the USA, and that distance plus the veto and the Security Council membership plus the nuclear weapon status would give China a leverage in international affairs where India has to be very, very careful in putting all its eggs in the Chinese basket. Then this takes us to the third large partner which India has, which is the EU. Now, most people don't even think in terms of EU as the third largest trading partner for India, but actually EU, if you take EU as a multinational body, has a very large share of India's trade. And India's trade in EU is difficult to measure properly because India has a trade which is substantial with France, substantial with Germany, but small bits add up. You add up Italy, you add up Netherlands, you add up Belgium, and this comes to. Now, it is not as if India can use EU as an option to offset its trade with China, because there are two obvious things. That first of all, the European goods and services are far more expensive than what India is getting from China. then also the European countries do not have the products which India needs, not only in terms of price bracket, but in terms of technology which it can absorb and so on. Then again, if it comes to Indian exports, the European Union has also dragged its feet. After years, the free trade agreement talks have been taken up again after 6 years. The European countries are very fussy about erecting non-trade barriers, particularly against India, on phytosanitary objections, on its fruits, vegetables, grains. They also have problems about India's human rights record, India's environmental record. Now, this is again hypocrisy of the first instance, because none of these questions are raised against China of human rights violations in Xinjiang and Uyghur Muslims, about environmental dislocation, whether the Three Gorges Dam is made, or about exploitation of labor laws or suppression of democratic dissent in Hong Kong. But when it comes to India, India is put in the dock. So India is going to have a bit of a problem trying to increase its trade relationship with European Union. The European Unions have other problem, that they take decisions as a composite multinational organization on consensus. This consensus has been evading them ever since the East European members have been dragging their feet, Hungary and Poland, and especially after the war in Ukraine, there has been the issue of Scandinavian countries joining NATO and what the repercussion might be in Russia. If Ukraine is given candidate status in European Union, how it will impact the other members, what kinds of sops the Europeans would have to give other dissatisfied members of the East European members of the European Union, how will they cope with the sanctions imposed on Russia. Countries like the Czech Republic, Slovenia, and Baltic republics would be so much under Russian pressure that European Union's consensual attitude to be more friendly and receptive towards India and make India its major trade partner is going to be a very difficult challenge to meet with. But at the same time, what remains there is that in all, European companies active in India are more than 17,000. They are employing 1.5 billion Indians, and they generate indirect employment for 5 times this number. So the European companies have also had a genuine complaint that the ease of doing business in India is not ideal, regardless of whatever claims the government makes. There has been retrospective legislation, as the Vodafone case instead, about taxation or about amalgamation of companies or share being transferred and so on. So the fact remains that the Government of India would have to convince the Europeans that the ease of doing business and the rule of law is really as tight in India as it is elsewhere, and it should try for reciprocity when it comes to phytosanitary restrictions or issues about human rights or environmental issues. So these are the 3 major: America, China, and European Union, which we have discussed. Which brings us to Russia. And Russia is interesting. Russia is not even the 4th, 5th, 6th trading partner of India, because the figures which we have for Indo-Russian trade are very misleading. They keep out the figures of arms trade or the spares trade. They deal only with the non-arms trade, and the figure here is about just $10 billion after all these years of fraternal relationship, time-tested friendship. And it has been argued now that the Indians will meet the target, scale up this trade to $30 billion within the next couple of years. Highly unlikely, because there has been an existing mechanism at the government-to-government level, at business association to business association level, and there have been several intergovernmental commissions. There have been high-level summits between foreign ministers, petroleum ministers, economic ministers. But somehow or other, despite the personal context at the highest level, the breakthrough seemed to be apparent when Prime Minister Modi went to Vladivostok and talked of the Sangam, and the when Prime Minister Modi made this overture about developing the Far East together as an Asian part, Putin welcomed the idea, but not much progress has come out of it. But as in the changed circumstances after the Ukraine war, the Russian oil becomes very important for India. And it has been argued that India is getting at 30% discounted rate Russian oil, which is coming to India. What makes it a little easier is that somewhere in Estonia, there was a company called SR, which was once owned by an Indian industrialist. Now the ownership has changed, but there has been this relationship where the tankers could carry oil from this port to India. It is a longer route. It could be more expensive route to travel, but the oil would come to India. And when it comes to India, it has been also alleged that India is exporting it back again to Europe, which is an extremely unfair allegation, because even Saudi Arabs and the UAE are picking up the slack in oil, which denied the export to Europe, is lying with Russia. Russians have given a very interesting purchase options to various other countries if they want to import Russian oil. Not only the price is discounted, it can be paid in rubles, it can be paid in Chinese currency, it can be paid in kind, it can be a barter trade like it used to happen once upon a time in the rupee-ruble trade during India. And also, Indians would now, it is speculated, very soon be importing almost 20% of their total requirements of oil from Russia. Now, when the Russian oil goes to UAE or Saudi Arabia, nobody keeps track whether the hydrocarbons are mixed and Saudi Arabia mixes it with its own extraction and sends it to Europe. So this is something which I think India has to tread carefully in its relationship with Russians. We cannot expect the kind of massive financial investment in India in the present circumstances from Russia as we once thought. Technology transfer remains an issue, very much so. But Indian investment also, massive billion-dollar investments in Sakhalin, are things of past. But the fact remains that in changed circumstances, India is having a very close relook at its economic relationship with Russia, not only relationship with Russia, but also in the context of its relationship with Iran, its context of its relationship with Central Asian republics, which are rich stores, repositories of gas and oil, like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, etc. So I think this is what the broad picture is, that the broad picture is that the world international economy is coping with this stagflation. American economy is groaning under a recession, but it is trying to cope to redeem itself by high federal rates, which might have an adverse impact on India. The rupee falling against dollar is not a guarantee that Indian export will increase. India should be in a position to export competitively, and this can only happen when there is foreign investment in India, there is ease of business, there is upgrading of skills in manufacturing sector, and there is a balance between India's agricultural sector, which employs a majority of its people, an organized sector, and also the organized industrial sector. So there should not be a lopsided growth in Indian economy in the recovery phase. This is what India has to worry about. India has to worry about building up its economic relationship in immediate neighborhood, in ASEAN countries, in countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and in the Gulf countries. This is all we have for you this time. And as you must have noticed, we focus primarily on economic dimension of international relationship this time. We started with the stock taking of the war in Ukraine. We discussed a variety of things: the loss of life, the loss of property, the refugee problem, the weaponry being used, red lines being crossed, double standards about human rights and war crimes, and grandstanding, psychological war. All these dimensions were there, but this all was there to prepare the ground for the economic consequences of Ukraine war, which the rest of the world is going to bear in terms of food security, in terms of energy security. And then we had a long, detailed look on how the international economic situation is emerging, particularly in the context of India's international trade relationships. We noticed the ironical situation that where, despite the COVID war, despite the Galwan conflict, India's trade with China has increased phenomenally, so has the trade imbalance. We also had a look that USA continues to be India's largest trade partner, but US economy under trouble itself is likely to have an adverse impact in near future with rupee falling in comparison to dollar, Indian exports not necessarily increasing because of this, foreign capital flighting out of India because of federal rates increasing in America, adversely impacting on employment generation and India's economic health here. We also noticed that how India has few options in terms of rebuilding its economic relationships, looking for other options. In Europe, we will in near future have a closer look at what we promised of the conflicts and schisms within European Union. But at the moment, we just focus that European Union may be the number 3 trading partner for India, but it is split into major powers in Europe, France and Germany, on the fringes outside European Union after Brexit Britain, and you have India's relationship with European Union predicated on a consensuous decision making, which may not always be to India's advantage. So we would like you to keep this in mind. Keep this in mind that India has to restructure its economic relationships globally, focusing more on the neighborhood, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, also ASEAN countries, and then selectively target countries which have a complementarity with us in Europe, not necessarily European Union as a union, but as countries within European Union which can find this complementarity with us. We have to still worry about phytosanitary restrictions, worry about environmental concerns, worry about human rights, but India has to push back and confront the double standards and hypocrisy of European Union. Think about these things till we meet again. Thank you and goodbye.